All right. Hello. Welcome. If you don't know who I am, I'm kind of surprised. But for those of you online who have never seen my face, hello. It is I, Seer, the Seeker of Kelp, the Tokota historian, the price questioner of all things. I have no slideshow for this because I wasn't sure if we were going to have anything to project onto, and frankly, I was just going to kind of wing this to begin with. So this panel is titled in its entirety, Tokotas Through the Lens of Reality, Game Mechanics, Timelines, Lore, and More. Which is to say, basically, I'm just going to talk about headcanons and how I justify all the weird shit that happens in Tokota. And then you can decide if that's something you want to do for your stuff, too. So the best thing to start with is probably game mechanics, because, like, I mean, you can just play the game and not care at all about how game mechanics actually play into how your story plays out in Tokota. But for me, I'm always trying to find some dumb way to justify everything that's happening. So for example, let's talk about DC, since we just had a lovely presentation on DC. Why does DC have restrictions on how much of a Tokota you have to show? Why does the Tokota always have to be in the same position every single time? Why can't we lower their heads? It's because it's a passport system. They're registering the Tokotas. And it has to be like a passport. So you can't have the Tokota facing the other way. You can't have the Tokota sitting, because you have to have a standard for this passport registration. Hence why you can go back later and add things, because you're just updating your passport image. Are you enjoying this so far? Very good. This is how my brain functions. This is also why it takes so long to get your Tokota through DC, is because you have to go through the passport office. Come on, guys. This is why it takes so long. And frankly, I've been there, done that. It's a time. Let's talk, though, activities. If we're thinking in this same vein, what entity might exist in Tokotas that wants to regulate what items you have in your inventory that your Tokotas can bring back? The TCA, the Tokota Cultural Association, one might say. Now, let's think about this logically here. Why might the TCA care if your Tokota is hunting deer versus hunting rabbits? Anyone?
Population.
Oh, yeah.
Population control, yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
That's the one from the boondocks.
So, if we think about it like that, the TCA wants to know if your Tokota is doing a fishing, a hunting, an exploring, etc., because they need to know what's happening everywhere all over Tokota. And this is why you need a certain number of elements in your backgrounds. Because the TCA person has to be able to look at this lovely photograph that you've taken of your Tokotas out on their adventures and be able to say, ah yes, that's the soul pool. Good stuff. All right, so Jimmy Joe went down to the soul pool, and it says here on your form that Jimmy Joe brought back some soul pool water. Yeah, that sounds about right. Write that off, right? All right, here you go. Here's your certificate that says you can now trade this soul pool water to anyone you want, if you so desire. Put it in your bank. I mean, you can just stare at it if you want. But the important thing is that you went to the soul pool and you got yourself some soul pool water. But if you go down to Keswick Bay, let's say, and you're like, my Tokotas are going fishing. You send in your report to the TCA, and they get the picture, and they're like,
Where are the fish?
is that 3 Tokotas or 4? Is that another Tokota in the back, or is that a... If there's a question here, the TCA has to send you back your report and say, this photograph sucks, please pick a different one. And by that I mean, please make it so that all of your Tokotas show at least 75%, so that we can actually judge this and say, yes, that Tokota was there. It definitely wasn't, just some figment of someone's imagination or something. But this might also explain then why you can't take one activity and say this is a hunt for this Tokota and this is a fishing for this Tokota. It's because you got to fill out separate forms, different departments. It's got to end up on someone else's desk. I'm just saying. Let's talk about literature. So if we follow this same path, why do we have requirements for literature for activities?
It's a journal.
Journal. Exactly. So instead of taking a photograph of your Tokotas out doing an activity, you instead do a nice little journal write-up here, and you're like, you know, I don't know, we went to the Tokotas, and the cicadas were singing real loud, and it was really obnoxious. I really hope they stop singing. And we discovered that there were poachers out here, so you might want to do something about that. And TCO looks at them and we're like, that's a good point. The cicadas, they are loud. And you know what? There are some poachers out there. Better send somebody out there. All right. Looks like you brought back some sticks. Good job, buddy. You send it on back. And that's activities. Are there any departments in particular that anyone wants to try to justify in the world of Tokotas?
DC.
I already did DC. You missed DC. It's the passport office. That's probably why it takes so long.
Always pictured you send in your abandoned pups so they can be painted. Here you go.
Okay, but funnily enough, I was thinking about breeding the other day and how that might logically work, because I believe we still have written into the species description that Tokotas are the type that usually have a very long lead up to choosing a mate. And so that, I believe this is still written somewhere. This was the way it was back in the old days, but basically that all breedings that happen are like, obviously like human planned, and there's human intervention involved there because Tokotas have to like, it's kind of like wolves, you know, they have to go and they have to see, is this actually a fit mate for me? I don't know. But no, so then I was thinking, I was like, the breeding is kind of like a two-part thing. So like when you submit it that first time with the form, you're like, it's like you're reaching out to the TCA, let's say, and you're like, hey, I'm gonna be breeding these two Tokotas. Does that sound good? And then they gotta look at it and they gotta be like, yeah, those Tokotas, they can still be bred. They're not related, and you're saying they're not related, that's fine by me. And you're like, cool beans, all right, see you in however many months it takes for a Tokota to have puppies. But then, when the puppies are born, you need an official to come from the TCA to come and register the litter to prove that all of those pups were actually born in this litter and are vital offspring of the Tokotas. And that's why you can't just, you know, make up a random geno, because you're like, I found this Tokota on the side of the street, and you're like, okay, well, did you like find it on some expedition? You're like, no, and they're like, okay, well, did you register the breeding? Like, was this like approved by like a breeding official? And you're like, no, and they're like, okay, well then how do we know this is actually a Tokota? This could just be like a dog.
Or who did you steal this from?
Where'd you steal this from? Are you a poacher? So no. So that's why breeding, you have to have the form correct, but then you can't get the litter when there's form correction because you got to send it back in because, you know, they didn't approve your breeding the first time. But then you have to have them approve the breeding. But then, you know, not all pups, you know, end up becoming anything. Anyway, that's a whole nother rabbit hole. All right, let's move on to something else. Let's see here. Game mechanics. Toko evolution. I love talking about Toko evolution. So, why are standard Tokotas the default, logically, here? Why is it that if you breed, say, 2 Dakinos, you get standards out of it? Why is this possible? Well, there's a lot to talk about here. To keep it short and sweet and simple, presumably, Akotas were like the first like true Tokota that happened, you know, back with like the mammoths and stuff. And then gradually, as the humans were interacting with them and stuff, of course the megafauna start dying out because, you know, Tokotas kind of follows exactly like kind of what Earth does. And so logically then we want to start breeding towards smaller individuals that don't need as much food to eat because there isn't as much big prey, which is where dyers come into play. So then, you know, you probably have dyers and Dakotas occurring in the same time span. This is probably approximately when humans start domesticating Dakotas, which then leads you to a big dyer eats a lot and takes up a lot of space, takes a lot of resources. And do humans actually need a dyer in terms of a Tokota size? So gradually those start getting bred smaller into a standard, which is also then you could justify how we end up with the dyer percentages, because we're gradually breeding them down to be smaller, potentially, Which then also begs the question, Dakinos, did they exist in prehistoric times? I say yes. I say that during the time where there were still Tokotas and there were Dyers, there were probably Dakinos, but Dakinos didn't thrive in the circumstances that standard Tokotas did. And that's why, if you breed two Dakinos, you get standard Tokotas. And it's because standard Tokotas are more evolutionarily fit for just like the world of Tokotna. But of course, now that, humans are breeding them, so now you can have, Tokotas and Dyers breed to have a Dakino, and of course we have traits and stuff that help with that. Speaking of which, traits. How do you think I justify traits? Is there a need to justify traits? Silence.
I feel
Definitely.
like you should do it.
I should okay. So the short answer here is that I think traits kind of work like, you take your Tokota to obedience training and they learn to sit, kind of a deal. But you take your Tokota to class and they learn what it needs to be a hunter, and so then they have, a better eye for finding prey with nice pelts, and so then the pelts they bring back are worth more, in the bank. Something like that. And then unique traits are something that's inherently taught from parent to child, and that's why you can't just, have Joe Schmo down the street suddenly learning what it means to be a forager because he didn't learn it from a parent. Super secret. Nobody can know. Only the bloodline can know.
Family recipe.
The family recipe.
Crap.
So true. But anyway, very briefly to continue talking about builds, I think, personally, and this is just me, with World Tour, the way I'm envisioning this is that, we're finding some of these, but then we're also, they've been being bred for this whole time. We're just kind of, rediscovering that they are, in fact, subspecies of Tokotas and not a separate species or just, a genetic variation. So, Tokis. Tokis didn't actually start out as a mutation because they started out as dwarfism, which could randomly occur. Which, when you think about it, makes sense if you're starting out because, we're breeding Tokotas, to ride around and stuff, and Tokis are, kind of small. But so, starts out like that. But then, obviously, humans are like, oh, it's so small and cute. He's just a little guy who weighs 400 pounds and could squish me. So then we start breeding it intentionally. And then, gradually we end up where it's no longer just a random thing that happens. It's actually a gene that we've selected for, and now we actually breed Tokis, and Tokis are their own subspecies now because literally we've bred them like that. And so kind of take that logic into the other Tokotas and stuff. But I should probably stop talking about this one and move on to another topic, otherwise we're never going to get anywhere. But this is a good segue into lore. And talking about how do we have deities that are builds that may not have existed at the beginning of Tokotas. For example, before Tokis existed, how did Sikranurk exist? My logic here says that Sikranurk was always just described as a very small Tokota, or a puppy, always a puppy-sized Tokota. And then, gradually as humans started breeding Tokis, they're oh, Sikranurk's a Toki. That just makes sense. You could also argue, of course, that deities change their shapes. They're just they decide one day, well, I'm tired of being a big Tokota. I'm just going to be small. And then you end up like that. You could also just hand wave it and just say, yeah, they're just small. It just happens. Sometimes you just imagine it and you're I don't know what this is yet. And then one day you're yeah, it's a Toki. And that's just the way it be.
They got seduced by the dealer call. They didn't come back with me. I'll be back later.
Alrighty. Does anyone have any questions about the lens of reality when it comes to builds or lore? Anything you want me to dive into specifically?
Shrine.
Shrine? How does shrine work? Alright. So, do you want the gruesome or do you want the happy, cheerful?
Gruesome.
Gruesome. Well, I mean,
I don't know.
it really it's one of those things that like I feel like, you know, I can tell you all day what I think, but obviously with all of this stuff that I'm telling you, take what you want. Don't take what you want. Like, you do whatever makes you happy. Like, I'm just here to tell you what my thought process is, and you know, maybe that'll help you come up with something cool to try for your art, but you don't have to. For Shrine, the way I see it kind of is like, well, you have puppies from a litter, and there are too many puppies, obviously, because we breed a lot of Tokotas. But IPAC does need Tokotas to help run like the garden and stuff. And so you do literally take the Tokotas to IPAC, and IPAC's like, yeah, you're employed. And then they, you know, they go with IPAC, and you know, if they happen to become a spiritual entity, I mean, that's on them. But who knows? You might shrine a Tokota, and then one day it comes back as a TCA. Rehoming Tokota. Or a wild Tokota, you never know.
That's the best employment for them.
Yeah. Yes, Jill.
I would like you to justify this with Mielenik.
With Mealy? I mean, Mealy gets hungry. Mealy gets hungry, that's just the way it is.
Sometimes we willingly feed Mealy.
Yeah, because that keeps
Otherwise,
Mealy from taking the ones we want most of the time.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
That's why
Not
I
for
said most
some.
of the time.
Mealy is the meanest MFer when it comes to breeding.
I don't trust the Mealy sprites. I'll put them on my Tokotas for other people, but I will not use them.
Tell you, there have been times where I'm like, oh, not the mealy sprite, and then it rolls on like the best, you know, and I'm like, oh,
Every time.
use the mealy sprite.
Every time.
Not to bash the mealy sprite, because it's great. It's a fun, high risk, high reward thing, but like there are times where he's very mean.
Mealy owns the first popular Yeti, Toki.
Yep, that sounds about right.
Don't say that.
Mealy has consumed some of the rarest, most intensely amazing breeding tokos. Like high risk, wow, and Mealy has consumed it.
You know what we should do? We should have a super rare random event where you have to bargain with Mealy. And then you can get one of the pups that he's eaten.
Oh.
Or you can resurrect a pup that he's eaten of your own.
That's true. But of
Let's do
course,
Wow.
you'd have to make it really hard to do too. It would kind of have to have like
It
an
would
element
be
of randomness.
Like an AM1 RE or something.
Yeah, it would have to be rare like that, but then probably also involve, you know, like you give them, you know, 500 treats, and that's like a 50% chance that he gives you a pup. And otherwise, he's just like, ha, tasty snack, nugget out. And you're like, oh, okay,
The
this is
problem
awkward.
is, the non-rare pups that Mealy has eaten will also be in this pool,
That's true too.
right?
There's no guarantee you'll get something cool. But then it also does give people a reason to use the Mealy if they're not typically going to use the Mealy, because there is a chance that if there's a good pup, it'll come back into the game someday.
Maybe.
But
Unless it worked like the remove infertility one where you can hold on to it until you want to use it.
You just craft 5 POTA tokens into one Mealy resurrection.
Yeah. I mean, we did it on the first one so that it would be consistent and people wouldn't feel like it was Toko Times, always taking the best pup. We're like, so it's gonna be the first one. That way it'll be simple. Holy crap. That has murdered so many good pups.
it really has. RNG is cruel.
It is. It's RNGesus is mean.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. All right. What's next on my little list of topics here? Oh, let's see here.
Well, speaking of REs.
How do I justify REs?
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically kind of the same vein as the activities talk, I would argue, where, you know, like you're reporting on what your Tokota did, and then they email you back, and they're like, okay, but I heard that you also came across this random woman in the woods who was like crying about her wedding. Are you gonna tell me about that, or? And then you're kind of like, no comment. And then they're like, okay, well then, fuck off. And you're just like, oh, okay, well. Or you're like, oh yeah, I patted her back so soothingly, and I gave her, you know, she was like, wow, thanks so much. Here's some gold. And I was like, cool. And the TCO was like, seems legit. Okay, here you go. Well, that's kind of how I feel about the REs. Those are like almost kind of like, because of the way they're written, it's like a scenario. So for me, that's like, they're kind of already like integrated. But let's talk about starters. Starters and low ID Tokotas. How do low ID Tokotas still exist in the breeding pool today? Now, obviously the hand wavy for this is we can just say, magical timey-wimey stuff happened, and then suddenly the Tokota went through a wormhole and is now here. Woo! Or, for starters specifically, what I think is that they die, and IPAC will resurrect them.
No.
Gives them like eternal life, because they are like a cornerstone of something that like, they're like a representation of something that Tokotas are meant to be. So like Nanook is the first black Tokota. And so he has like this very important job of being the first like registered Tokota, the first Tokota. Maybe there's some story, some lore about how he was the first domesticated Tokota. And that's part of the reason why he's so important. And so, you know, maybe when he died, IPAC was like, it would be a real shame to lose someone so important to the species moving forward, and brings him back, you know? And then, you know, that could also explain why they had redesigns, is, you know, they died and then he resurrected them in a new body with a new design. But this doesn't
It's a
explain.
reward for being such a good representative.
Yeah.
Looks better.
How long did they live?
That is a good question.
How long does Tokotas live?
I believe it's about 30 years in captivity for standard Tokotas.
In the wild?
In the wild, I think it's about 14 is what we have listed on the site.
I'd need
We're only
gold.
at 10, guys.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. This adds another layer of complexity. Now, hold up. This adds,
They're allowed to still be alive.
well, this
They start
depends.
dying soon.
This depends on
25th
if you
anniversary,
consider.
we're like, guess who all is dead?
This depends too a lot on what you consider the timeline of Tokotas. Because if we're saying that Tokotas as a species have only been being registered for 10 years, how the hell have we bred this many Tokotas? How is it that a Tokota gets pregnant with puppies, births them like a week later, and those Tokotas are full grown in like a month? That's
Three
something.
litters back to back.
3 litters back to back, same month even. And so like that's something that for me, I say that the history of Tokotas as a species has actually spanned multiple hundreds of years. At this point, I would consider the time that I started Tokotas to be approximately 150 years, quote unquote, like in the past, based on where like I consider my Tokotas stories right now. Which still begs the question, low ID Tokotas, how do they exist? Any takers? Any
First passports.
The first passports. Actually, Tokota started when they invented the camera. That's how they were registering them. But no. There's a lot of different ways you can spin it. You could spin it that, you know, if you're breeding a low ID Tokota, you're actually, you know, breeding using like their straws, you know, like we had back in the day when we had Fenrir and his 3 straws. You could argue that Tokota is dead, but you can use those low ID Tokotas in activities still. You could argue that, you know, if they are dead, that you're actually just redeeming, quote unquote, old activities, you know, from back in the day when they were still alive, and that's how you're doing it. But you could also just say that your Tokota jumped in a wormhole and is now here in the modern day. There really is no good way to like logically justify like having a low ID Tokota with like a late ID Tokota, unless you are saying that like we literally have only spanned 10 years in the land of Tokota. But you know, that's part of the fun of it. You just kind of get creative with it. Sometimes you're like, logically, this is what we're doing. Other times you're like, I just want a silly answer. They jumped in a wormhole. Otherwise, you can just kind of hand wave and say, magic. The power of IPAC.
The soul pool is really the fountain of youth.
Exactly. You gain immortality when you become dominant because you drink the magical water that glows. It's definitely not drugs.
So
Definitely not
dom
drugs.
before their end of lifespan. Your average Toko just keel over in 15 to 20 years.
I didn't get some dominant rights.
Yeah, that's still, there's a lot of
But that's
submissive
why
and
you
average
bring
back-
Tokotas.
That's why you're bringing back buckets of soul pool water.
Oh my god, you're just like
So
chucking
you
down
can
those.
dump them on your
You could feed it
Tokos.
to the low ID Tokos periodically.
Oh my gosh.
Keep them in stasis.
Alright, that approximately sums up all of the points that I had listed for myself to like talk about or justify. So are there any other topics or Tokota things that you want me to try to justify in the world of Tokotas? Does anyone in Discord have anything? Actually, let me go look at that.
Yeah.
Rites of fertility. Am I walking around with a clipboard going, yeah, you look fine?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, flip
Basically,
leg.
yep.
That looks functional.
Lift up the Tokota and you're like, I think
Am I
DC, I don't think the import, the passports here, I don't think, something went wrong here. Alright, let me see here. I don't see anything
And then there's
in
always the
podcast
joke of the
questions, but I
teen
do
glue.
see disc type.
From HU.
Oh, I just
There.
did something.
Hello. You what?
I just did something, I'm not asking anything.
Oh, okay. Carry on.
I don't even know who
Speaking of
that
HUs,
was.
though. It's the right way around.
Maybe shrine is actually a gift because there's the only Dakotas actually allowed to die.
It's actually a blessing for them. They can finally rest. Oh god, that's grim.
Well, it is possible to just use
Well, yeah, you're
Dakotas.
allowed
That's
to.
There's a
true.
whole mechanic for it, but they do have a one resurrection.
Never forget the one Tokota that died because it overbred.
One
May she rest in peace.
is.
Oh, never forget. Moment of silence. Anyway, that's it for me then. Thanks, y'all. Goodbye. End stream.